In the small, forgotten town of Elmsfield, the house at the edge of Pine Street had always been a subject of local whispers. The house was large, with a rusted iron gate, a creaky wooden porch, and windows that never seemed to let in enough light. But the strangest thing about it wasn't its decaying structure. It was the silence that surrounded it. People who lived near it said they'd heard things, faint whispers at night, a distant scratching sound as though something was trying to claw its way out. But the truth was far darker, and only the house knew it. Ethan had grown up hearing these stories. As a boy, he dared to sneak into the yard at night, pressing his ear against the cold brick of the house, trying to catch the whispers. But as he grew older, he forgot. He moved away, built a life, and tried to forget the past. But when his mother passed away and left him the house, he had no choice but to return. Returning to Elmsfield was a bitter homecoming. Ethan had always resented the town, the way it held onto its secrets like an old, worn-out blanket. But now, with no family left, he had inherited the house, and with it, the weight of its history. The first night Ethan spent in the house was uneventful. The air was thick with dust, and the house smelled of old wood and decay. As he wandered through the rooms, he could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in dusty sheets, as if the house had been frozen in time. But as the night deepened, a strange unease crept over him. The air grew heavier, and the silence seemed unnatural. It wasn't the silence of a quiet house. It was the silence of a place that was waiting, as if it were biding its time. Ethan was lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, when it started. At first, it was so soft that he thought it was just his imagination. A whisper, barely audible, as if someone was standing in the corner of the room, speaking just below the threshold of hearing. His heart skipped a beat. He sat up, the darkness pressing in around him. He listened. There it was again, a whisper. It was coming from the walls. Ethan tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the house settling. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They began to sound more like words, more distinct, though he could never quite make them out. The noise seemed to come from behind the plaster, from deep within the house's very bones. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whispers, urging him, calling him. He could feel the walls moving, shifting, like the house itself was alive. The next day, he searched the house, looking for some explanation. He checked the plumbing, the pipes, the foundations. There was nothing. Everything was solid. But when he reached the basement, he stopped. The door was cracked open, a thin sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. Ethan hesitated. He knew better than to go down there. But something was pulling him, a compulsion he couldn't resist. He gripped the doorknob, and the moment he twisted it, the whispering stopped. The basement was cold. Too cold. It smelled of mildew, but there was something else, something rotten, hidden beneath the musty air. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he descended the stairs, and with each step, the air seemed to thicken, heavier, as if something were watching him from the shadows. The basement was full of old furniture, cobwebbed chairs, cracked mirrors, piles of old newspapers. It was a graveyard of forgotten things. But as he shone the light around, he saw something else. In the far corner, a small wooden door stood ajar. It was unlike the others. This one was solid, heavy, like a vault door. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable. Come closer. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. His breath came in short gasps. He knew he should turn around, leave, but he couldn't. The door called to him. He approached it, each step feeling like it was pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape. When his fingers brushed the door, it swung open by itself, creaking on its rusty hinges. What he saw beyond it wasn't a room. It was a void that seemed to stretch on forever, an emptiness so deep that Ethan felt it in his soul. The darkness within seemed to swallow the light of his flashlight, leaving only a heavy, oppressive silence. The whispers came again, louder now, sharper. "You're mine now." The next morning, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Neighbors would later say they hadn't seen Ethan for days, and when someone finally went to check on him, they found the house abandoned. The front door stood wide open, but inside, there was no sign of him. No sign of any struggle. Just an old house, and the same whispers that had haunted it for decades. To this day, no one knows what happened to Ethan. Some say he simply left, but others know better. They say the house claimed him, just like it had claimed all the others. The whispers still linger, deep within the walls, waiting for the next person foolish enough to listen. Rachel moved in, expecting a simple, albeit run-down home. The floors creaked, the wallpaper was peeling, and the smell of must hung thick in the air. But it was hers, and for the first time in months, she felt a strange sense of calm. At night, the house seemed to settle, groaning with age. But it wasn't until the third night that something truly unsettling happened. Rachel was lying in bed, reading a book to pass the time, when she heard it. A tap. Soft at first, almost as if someone were knocking on the window. She sat up, the book slipping from her hands as she strained to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. Tap, 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 like fingernails lightly scraping against the glass. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She slowly turned toward the window, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. The window was in the far corner, shrouded in darkness. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the room staring back at her. But as she looked closer, she saw something. Movement in the glass. Two shapes, small and shadowy, just at the edge of the window. Eyes. Eyes that seemed to be staring directly at her. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared, unblinking, cold and distant. Rachel's blood ran cold. She stood up, slowly, her body trembling with fear. She walked toward the window, her breath shallow and quick, as if she were holding her breath in anticipation. When she pulled back the curtain, the eyes were gone. She stepped back, confused, almost relieved. But then she noticed something strange. The window was still locked. How had they moved if no one had opened it? That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. The tapping came again, at the same time, the same soft, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was maddening. She tried to ignore it, convinced it was just the wind or some animal, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The eyes were back. The next night she took action. She had to know. She had to see what was causing it. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of grim determination, she approached the window. As she neared it, the tapping stopped. A cold chill ran down her spine as she pulled the curtain back. Nothing. No eyes, no shapes. Just the reflection of the room, dimly lit by the flashlight. But as she was about to turn away, she saw it. A faint imprint on the glass, right where the eyes had been. It was an outline, smudged and distorted, as if someone had pressed their face against the window. That was when Rachel realized someone had been watching her. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and dread. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the eyes in the window. She kept the curtains drawn at all times, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Then, late one evening, she heard it again. The tap, 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 tap. This time she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter and ran to the window. But when she pulled back the curtain, the eyes were already there, staring back at her through the glass. Only this time, they weren't alone. Dozens of eyes filled the window, all staring, all cold and unblinking, like 1,000 silent witnesses. The tapping grew louder, frantic, as if something or someone was trying to get in. Rachel stumbled back, her breath quick and shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She dropped the knife, the cold, clammy fear spreading through her body. She backed away from the window, but it was too late. The eyes were everywhere now, on the walls, the ceiling, in the dark corners of the room. And then, in the deepest part of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. A pale, gaunt face with hollow, empty eyes. It smiled at her, slowly, menacingly, as the room seemed to close in around her. Rachel tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her vision blurred as the figure stepped closer, the eyes growing larger, closer, until they filled her entire world. She reached out, but her hand passed through nothing. There was nothing solid anymore, just a deep, endless blackness. The next morning, the house was quiet again. The eyes were gone, the figure was gone, and Rachel was gone too. Neighbors would later say they hadn't seen her for days, and when someone finally went to check, the house was empty. No sign of a struggle, no trace of Rachel. Just a dusty old house and the eyes in the window, staring out into the emptiness of Greendale. No one ever dared to live in the house again, but the eyes still watch from the windows, waiting for someone foolish enough to move in. And on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you might just hear the faint tap, tap, tap of fingers on glass. The farmhouse was everything Sarah had imagined. It was large, weathered, and covered in ivy, with a wraparound porch that seemed to stretch forever. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something old. But it was peaceful, and that's all she needed. At first, everything seemed perfect. The creaking of the floorboards became the music of solitude. The hum of the wind through the trees was a lullaby. But it didn't take long for Sarah to notice something wasn't right. Every night, just before she fell asleep, she would hear it, the whispering, low and soft, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind. But the whispers grew louder with each passing night. Sometimes they sounded like words, other times like unintelligible murmurs. They were always there, always close, just out of reach. But the shadows were the worst. One night, after a particularly unsettling whispering episode, Sarah decided to investigate. She grabbed her flashlight and ventured downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, as though it had been holding its breath. She made her way through the kitchen, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. As she passed the old dining room, she stopped dead in her tracks. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move. Not in the way that shadows shift when the light changes. No, these shadows writhed and twisted, like they were alive. Sarah's pulse quickened. She told herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the longer she stood there, the more the shadows seemed to look back at her, as if they were aware of her presence. A low whisper came from the corner of the room, a voice like a breath against her ear. "Leave now." She spun around, but there was no one there. Just the shadows, stretching long across the walls. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. The whispering grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It followed her, in the breeze outside, in the rustling of the trees. Sarah couldn't escape it. And then, one night, it happened. She was sitting in the living room reading a book when the air grew still. The house went silent, like it was waiting for something. And then she saw it. The shadows, not just in the corners of the room, but everywhere. They poured out of the walls, creeping along the floor, gathering in thick, moving masses. They began to form shapes, humanoid figures, with hollow eyes and mouths that stretched into grins. They whispered to her, their voices echoing in the room, 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. "Join us!" Terrified, Sarah ran to the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The shadows rushed toward her, swirling and twisting in the air. She screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The figures reached out, their cold, shadowy hands brushing against her skin, leaving a chill that sank into her bones. She tried to fight them off, but they were everywhere. They were inside her mind now, whispering things she didn't want to hear. She felt their weight on her chest, their breath on her neck, the darkness swallowing her whole. When the morning light finally broke through the windows, the house was still. Too still. Sarah's body was found the next day, lying in the center of the living room. Her face was frozen in terror, her eyes wide open, but there was no sign of any struggle. It was as though she had simply faded into the darkness. The neighbors said the house had claimed her, that the whispers had taken her soul, just like they had taken others before her. To this day, no one dares go near the farmhouse. They say the shadows still move, still whisper, and if you listen long enough, they'll come for you too. They wait for the lonely, the broken, and the desperate. They wait for the ones who think they can escape the darkness. And when you hear the whispers calling your name, it's already too late. Ellen checked into the town's only bed and breakfast, a cozy little place run by Mrs. Gladys, an elderly woman with an unsettling smile. Mrs. Gladys spoke in whispers, and whenever she mentioned the silent house, her eyes would dart nervously to the window, as if expecting something, or someone, to be watching. "Don't go near that house, dear," Mrs. Gladys warned her one evening. "Strange things happen there, things you don't want to know about." But Ellen, driven by curiosity, ignored the warning. She had heard it all before, the tales of ghosts, the stories of haunted houses. She was determined to write an article that would make her name. The next day, she ventured to the silent house. The front gate creaked as Ellen pushed it open. She had expected it to be locked, but to her surprise, the gate swung wide with ease. She stepped onto the property, the ground soft beneath her feet, as though the earth itself had grown tired of holding the house up. As she approached the front door, Ellen felt a strange pressure in the air, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Still no answer. Ellen tried the door handle, and it opened with a slow, deliberate creak. She stepped inside. The air in the house was cold, stagnant, as if the house had not been disturbed for years. The walls were lined with dusty portraits of people Ellen had never seen. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the rooms, and the floorboards groaned beneath her weight. It was empty, save for the furniture draped in white sheets. Yet, as Ellen moved further into the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The silence was oppressive, almost deafening. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed through the house, making her heart race. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her veins. Then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper from the far end of the hallway. "Ellen." She froze. There was no one else here. She was certain of it. But the voice, she had heard it clear as day. "Ellen, come to me." Against her better judgment, Ellen began to move toward the source of the voice. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her legs trembled, but she pressed on. The house seemed to grow darker with every passing moment. When she reached the end of the hallway, she found a door that hadn't been there before. A door she was sure had not existed when she first entered the house. It creaked open as though inviting her in. Inside, the room was small and empty, except for a rocking chair in the corner. The chair rocked back and forth, though there was no breeze. Ellen approached cautiously, her heart pounding. As she stepped closer to the chair, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Ellen, you were always meant to be here." Her fingers brushed the back of the chair, and suddenly, she was overwhelmed by a rush of cold air. The room went black. When the lights flickered back on, Ellen was no longer alone. A figure stood before her, cloaked in shadows. She could barely make out the details. An old woman, her face covered in a tangle of dark hair. The woman's eyes glowed faintly, like two orbs of fire. "You've come to learn the truth," the woman said in a voice that was both familiar and strange. "You are not the first, nor will you be the last." Ellen tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't move. The air was thick, as if the house itself was holding her in place. The woman reached out with long, bony fingers, brushing Ellen's cheek with a touch colder than ice. "The truth is, you never left," the woman whispered, her lips curling into a grin that stretched too wide, too far. The room went dark again. The next morning, the people of Windmill Hollow noticed something strange. The bed and breakfast where Ellen had stayed was empty, and so was the silent house. No one ever saw Ellen Harper again. But sometimes, late at night, people passing by the house claimed to hear the soft sound of a rocking chair creaking in the wind. And sometimes, they say, if you listen closely enough, you might hear a whisper calling your name. But be warned, if you hear it, it's already too late. Michael spent the first few days unpacking, getting used to the creaks of the floorboards, the draft in the corners, and the sounds of the old house settling. Everything was normal. But then, on the third day, he discovered the attic. He'd been up there before, but it was a storage room, filled with old furniture, boxes of dust-covered books, and a few forgotten trinkets. But on the far side of the attic, behind an old wardrobe, was something that caught his eye. A large, ornate mirror. It stood tall, its wooden frame intricately carved with designs he couldn't quite make out in the dim light. He could tell it was old, much older than the house itself. There was something about it that felt wrong, like it didn't belong. Curiosity gnawed at him. He reached out and brushed his fingers against the cool glass. For a moment, nothing happened. The reflection was just like any other. His own face, his unkempt hair, and the faint traces of dust on his shirt. But then, something strange happened. His reflection moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight twitch of his fingers. But it was enough to make Michael's stomach tighten. He looked closer. In the mirror, his reflection wasn't just mimicking him. It was doing things he wasn't doing. His reflection's lips curled into a smile, but Michael hadn't smiled. His heart raced as he pulled his hand back from the mirror, but the reflection didn't stop. It seemed to study him, its eyes dark and calculating. Michael could see it now. The reflection was not him. It was something else, something wrong. He quickly turned away, but the image of the mirror haunted him. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just behind him, stayed with him long after he left the attic. That night, sleep didn't come easy. He tossed and turned, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw the reflection in his mind, the twisted, mocking smile, the way it had looked at him, as though it knew something he didn't. The next day, Michael tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt an irresistible pull toward the attic. That mirror called to him in ways he couldn't explain. And so, once again, he found himself standing before it. This time, Michael was determined to prove that there was nothing wrong. He stood before the mirror, his face reflecting back at him in the glass, his hand steady at his side. He took a deep breath and looked directly into the eyes of his reflection. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, without warning, his reflection began to move. It wasn't subtle this time. The reflection stepped forward, lifting its hand toward the glass, mimicking his own movements. But it wasn't following him anymore. It was acting on its own. Michael recoiled, but it was too late. The reflection pressed its palm against the glass, and Michael felt a sudden chill crawl up his spine. He reached out to touch the mirror, but before his fingers could make contact, the reflection's hand slammed into the glass with a deafening crack. The glass didn't shatter, but it began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Michael stumbled back, his pulse racing, as the surface of the mirror began to distort. His own reflection started to twist, the features warping, the face stretching in unnatural ways. The reflection's eyes, those dark, empty eyes, seemed to stare right through him, and for the first time, Michael realized the truth. The reflection was not just watching him, it was waiting. Then, with a sudden horrifying clarity, Michael understood the reflection's intent. It wasn't a mirror, it was a doorway to a world he was not meant to enter. Before he could react, the glass rippled again, and the reflection reached out, not through the mirror, but from within it. Its hand shot forward, long and skeletal, grabbing Michael's arm and pulling him toward the glass. Michael screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the distorted, screeching sound that came from the mirror. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the room darker. He felt himself being drawn in, his body no longer his own, as though the mirror had a grip on his very soul. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. No sound of footsteps, no sign of life. The mirror in the attic stood untouched, its glass as clear and still as it had been the day Michael first found it. When the neighbors came to check on him, they found the house locked, and Michael nowhere to be found. His car was still in the driveway. His belongings were still inside, but there was no sign of him. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Weeks passed, and the house remained empty, the mirror still standing in the attic, waiting. But sometimes, if you stand in front of the house late at night, you might see it. A faint reflection in the attic window, a face staring back at you. And if you look closely enough, you might see Michael, trapped within the glass, staring at you with those same empty, pleading eyes. The mirror still waits, and if you're not careful, you might just find yourself pulled into it, your reflection the last thing you'll ever see. As he drove, Thomas spotted something strange in his rearview mirror. A figure standing by the side of the road, a woman. She was wearing a long, tattered white dress, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders, wild and unkempt. Thomas was used to seeing hitchhikers in these parts, but there was something about this woman that sent a chill down his spine. Her figure seemed almost unreal. He slowed down, his instincts kicking in. He couldn't leave her out there, not in the middle of nowhere. So, with a hesitant sigh, he pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" he called out. The woman didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her eyes hollow and distant. Thomas noticed something odd. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and there was a faint, strange glow about her. Her lips didn't move when she finally spoke, but her voice echoed in his mind, like a whisper in the wind. "Take me to Black Hollow," she said, her words slow and deliberate. Thomas frowned. Black Hollow was a few miles ahead, but there wasn't much to the place, just a small, quiet town. It didn't make sense. Why would she want to go there? "All right, hop in," he said, feeling an unsettling mix of pity and caution. The woman opened the door and climbed into the truck, her movements stiff, almost mechanical. As she sat beside him, Thomas noticed that she didn't smell like someone who had been standing out in the elements. Instead, there was an overwhelming scent of decay, like something long dead. As they drove, the silence between them grew thick. The woman didn't speak again, just stared out the window, her face shadowed by the dim light of the dashboard. Thomas tried to make small talk, but she remained silent. Her presence was heavy, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The road ahead was empty, the trees on either side casting long, eerie shadows across the path. It felt like they were the only two people left in the world. But as they neared the turnoff to Black Hollow, Thomas glanced over at the woman. And for the first time, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The woman had no reflection. He could see the road in the side mirror, but the seat beside him was empty. Her image wasn't reflected at all. His heart skipped a beat. He turned to look at her, but she didn't seem to notice. She was still staring out the window, completely motionless. Panic rose in Thomas's chest. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. She turned to look at him slowly, and when she did, Thomas felt the world around him go quiet. Her eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, locked onto his, and in that moment, it was as if time had stopped. Without a word, she pointed towards the road ahead. Her finger, pale and trembling, gestured to the old, decrepit sign that read, "Black Hollow." "I have to go now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the truck. Thomas was about to ask her what she meant, but before he could speak, the woman's figure seemed to flicker. The lights of the truck flickered with her, and suddenly, she was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving the seat beside him empty. His truck lurched, and Thomas slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. He stared at the empty seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to be imagining things. There was no way he had just seen what he thought he had. But when he looked out the windshield, his eyes widened in shock. The woman was standing at the edge of the road, her back to him, walking away. Thomas's hands shook as he tried to start the truck again. The engine sputtered to life, and he hit the gas, speeding past the woman. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, but in the corner of his vision, he saw her, walking along the edge, her feet dragging behind her, her tattered dress flowing like a ghostly veil. As he reached the turnoff to Black Hollow, Thomas glanced back in his rearview mirror. The woman was gone, but in the reflection of the mirror, he saw something else. A shadow. A dark, hulking figure standing in the distance, its eyes glowing faintly in the night. The chill that ran down his spine nearly made him swerve off the road. He hit the gas even harder, racing through the darkened road, desperate to get away from whatever had just happened. The figure in the mirror kept pace with him, no matter how fast he drove. Finally, just as he reached the outskirts of Black Hollow, the figure disappeared from the mirror. The tension in the air lifted slightly, but the fear didn't leave Thomas's chest. He kept driving, not daring to stop until he reached the town. The next morning, Thomas went back to Route 79 to see if he could find any trace of the woman, but there was nothing. No sign of her, no trace of her footsteps on the ground. Just an empty stretch of road. He never spoke about that night to anyone, not even his wife. But every year when he drove down that same route, he would pass through Black Hollow and remember the woman he picked up on that lonely road. And every time, without fail, he would see her, standing by the side of the road, her hollow eyes staring back at him. Sometimes, late at night, Thomas would still hear her voice in his dreams, whispering those same words, "Take me to Black Hollow." But now he knew the truth. She never asked to be taken there. She was already home. It began with subtle noises. At first, Emma chalked it up to the house settling. Old houses creaked after all. But then the noises became more distinct. The soft, rhythmic tapping from the walls. It sounded almost like someone was knocking from the inside. But when Emma would check, there was nothing there. One evening, as she was lying in bed, the sound came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall beside her bed. Emma sat up, her heart pounding. She got out of bed and pressed her ear to the wall, hoping it was just some pipes or the house settling again. But the tapping continued, unmistakable and deliberate. "Hello?" Emma called out, her voice shaking. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the tapping. She pulled away from the wall, her breath caught in her throat. Was it an animal? A raccoon or a squirrel in the attic? It didn't make sense. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, almost like a message. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The tapping continued, growing louder with each passing hour, as if it was getting closer to her. At one point, she swore she heard faint whispers, too soft to make out, but there nonetheless. She clutched her pillow tightly, her mind racing. It was just the house, she told herself. There had to be an explanation. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next day, Emma decided to call a local handyman to check the house. She needed to know if there was some structural issue causing the sounds. The handyman, an older man named Mr. Davis, came over that afternoon, his face creased with concern as soon as she told him about the tapping noises. "You know, Miss Carter," he said, scratching his chin, "this house has been here for a long time. A long time. Some say it has a history, things that are better left alone." Emma's curiosity piqued, but she didn't press him further. He seemed nervous, but she figured it was just his age catching up with him. He spent several hours checking the walls, the attic, and the basement, but found nothing. No animals, no leaks, no obvious issues. Still, the tapping continued that night. It was the following week when things escalated. Emma had invited a friend over, hoping to distract herself from the creeping dread that had settled over her. They were sitting in the living room chatting when the tapping began again. But this time, it was different. It was louder, faster, as though whatever was doing it was desperate to get her attention. Her friend Sarah looked at Emma, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Emma nodded, her voice barely a breath. "It's been happening for days. I don't know what to do." Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, from the corner of the room came a whisper, a voice so faint it could barely be heard, but Emma felt it. The voice was coming from the walls. "Help me." Emma froze, her blood running cold. Sarah looked at her confused. "What was that?" Before Emma could answer, the whispering came again, louder this time. "Help me, Emma." With a surge of panic, Emma jumped to her feet and grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to leave now." But as they reached the door, it slammed shut on its own. They both turned to see the walls around them begin to shake, as though something was trying to break through from the inside. The tapping resumed, but now it was frantic, as if something was clawing its way through the walls. Who's there?" Emma screamed. A figure appeared in the wall, its form a dark, shifting mass, like shadows twisted into human shape. It wasn't fully formed, just a silhouette, with glowing eyes staring directly at her. The whispers grew louder, now filled with desperation. "Please, help me." The figure reached out, its hand stretching from the wall, a pale, bony hand with long, ragged nails. Emma couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Just as the hand reached for her, a loud crash echoed through the house. The figure was pulled back into the wall, and the tapping stopped. The walls were still, silent. Emma and Sarah ran out of the house, never looking back. They didn't speak as they drove away, both too terrified to even acknowledge what had just happened. Emma never returned to the cottage. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those walls was still there, waiting for the next person to listen, waiting for someone to help. The house was abandoned not long after, the new owners never staying long enough to figure out the strange happenings within. They too heard the tapping. They too heard the whispers. But no one was ever able to help, and the walls of that house are still waiting. Sarah had always been close to her grandmother, who had passed away just a few weeks prior. When Sarah went to clean out her grandmother's house, she found the mirror tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic. It was heavy, almost too heavy for her to lift, but it seemed to call to her, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. Grandma always loved this, Sarah thought, as she carefully polished the glass. The reflection that stared back at her was clear, with no cracks or distortions. But when Sarah looked closely, she felt something strange, something unsettling. It was as if the mirror was alive, watching her every move. That night, she placed the mirror in her bedroom. It fit perfectly on the wall, reflecting the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Sarah admired it for a while before going to bed, but as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It began the very next night. As Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. Her eyes kept drifting toward the mirror. She tried to ignore it, but it felt as if it was calling her, drawing her in. At first, the shadows in the mirror were subtle. She thought it was just her imagination, a trick of the light. But then, she noticed something. The reflection of her room wasn't exactly the same. There was a shape in the corner, just beyond the edge of the mirror's frame. It looked like a shadow, but Sarah couldn't remember anything in the room that could cast such a dark, ominous shape. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The shadow seemed to move, ever so slightly. It wasn't a trick of the light. Something was in the mirror. Terrified, Sarah got out of bed and moved closer to the mirror. Her reflection was still the same. No changes, no odd shapes. But the shadow in the corner of the mirror's reflection grew darker, more defined. And then, it moved again, as if it was coming closer. Sarah's pulse raced as she stepped back. The shadow in the mirror was now looming right behind her reflection. It wasn't her shadow. It was something else. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer, but it seemed to grow, its form becoming clearer, more menacing. Sarah could feel its presence, as if it were watching her from within the mirror, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. Sarah couldn't sleep. The shadow was always there, lurking in the reflection, always just beyond her sight. She couldn't escape it, no matter how far she moved away from the mirror. It followed her. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, soft as a breeze. But soon, they grew louder, clearer. They came from the mirror, from the dark space where the shadow waited. Sarah would hear them in the dead of night, echoing in the stillness of her room. Faint voices calling her name. Her heart raced every time she heard them. The whispers were not of this world. They felt ancient, cold, full of malice. One night, as Sarah stood before the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The shadow was no longer just a silhouette. It had shape, a face, twisted and grotesque, staring back at her from the mirror. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. And then the voice came. "Sarah, come closer." She tried to pull away, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if the mirror had control of her. The shadow in the glass reached out, its hand pressing against the surface. Sarah's reflection mirrored the movement, but she wasn't in control of it. Her own reflection was moving against her will. The air grew thick with an icy chill as the shadow in the mirror smiled, its face twisted in a grin that was too wide, too horrifying to be real. It reached for her, its fingers stretching, thin and sharp like claws. "Come to me," it whispered, its voice now a low growl. "I've been waiting." In a panic, Sarah managed to break free from the mirror's grasp. She stumbled backward, crashing into her dresser. The room seemed to spin as the shadow in the glass grew larger, its form stretching, ready to step out of the frame and into the real world. "Help!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the whispers. The shadow's hand was almost out of the mirror, reaching for her, its cold fingers brushing the edge of her skin. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah ran from the room, slamming the door behind her. But as she bolted down the stairs, she could hear the whispers following her, the shadow's voice calling her name from the mirror she had left behind. Sarah didn't return to that house after that night. She didn't know if it was the mirror or something else, but she felt as though it had followed her. No matter where she went, she could always hear those whispers in the back of her mind. The shadow had left the mirror and was now in her thoughts. The mirror was found weeks later, abandoned on the side of the road. It was scratched, the glass shattered in several places, but the frame was still intact. And in the reflection, there was nothing. Just the cold, empty space of the room it had been left in. Sarah never looked back. She could still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, in the corners of her mind. The shadow had left its mark on her, and she knew it would never truly leave. Robert was a man of logic and reason. A school teacher in Black Hollow for over a decade, he had lived through the whispers and tales of his neighbors, dismissing them as superstition. "Old town stories," he would say with a chuckle, "folk tales from simpler times." But on this particular autumn night, something gnawed at the back of his mind. He had been working late at the school, grading papers, when the unmistakable whistle echoed through the empty halls. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a trick of the pipes. It was real, sharp, and unsettling. Robert shook it off as fatigue and began to lock up. The town of Black Hollow had long been quiet after dark, its narrow streets empty except for the occasional stray cat or raccoon. But tonight, the silence seemed heavier, more suffocating. His keys rattled as he locked the door, and as he turned, the sound came again. A single sharp whistle. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the whistle. It was the fact that it had come from the direction of the woods, the same woods that bordered the school grounds. With an uneasy chuckle, Robert told himself he was being foolish. He was alone in the building, his mind playing tricks on him. But then, it came again. Clearer this time, and closer. The whistler was near. Robert's pulse quickened as he stepped toward the door, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the dark hallway. He opened it, half expecting to see nothing but shadows and empty streets. But to his horror, the air outside felt thick with an unnatural stillness. And then, there it was again. A whistle, barely audible but unmistakably close. Robert spun around, his breath caught in his throat. The whistle seemed to be coming from the woods, deeper now, and almost mocking. "Who's out there?" Robert called, his voice trembling, unsure whether he wanted an answer. Silence followed. But then, the trees began to rustle, as if something or someone was moving through them. He could hear it now, the slow, deliberate crunch of leaves beneath footsteps, coming closer. Robert's mind raced. Could it be a prank? Someone from the town? But there was no one in Black Hollow at this hour, not after midnight. Everyone had gone to bed long ago. And then, as if the very air had thickened with dread, the whistle came again, sharp, piercing, and unmistakable. This time, it was no longer coming from the woods. It was coming from just behind him. Spinning around, Robert's eyes went wide with terror. Standing at the far end of the school parking lot, just beyond the lamplight, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, draped in a dark cloak that swallowed the faint moonlight. The figure didn't move, but the sound of the whistle, cold and haunting, was unmistakable. Robert tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging his fear, and then the whistle grew louder, sharper, almost deafening. It was then that Robert saw the thing he hadn't been able to make out before. The figure didn't have a face. It was an empty void, a swirling mass of shadows that stretched into the sky like a void between worlds. His heart pounded as he took a step back, his legs shaking. He fumbled for his phone, but the signal was dead. No calls, no messages, just a blank screen. The air around him felt suffocating. The whistler took a step forward, and Robert felt an overwhelming compulsion to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He tried to scream, but the whistle drowned out all sound. Then, in a voice so soft it barely registered in his ears, the whistler spoke. "You're next." Robert's mind screamed as the figure moved closer, its form twisting in unnatural ways. The whistle had stopped, replaced by the quiet rustling of the cloak against the wind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but the faint echo of its presence behind. The next morning, Robert was found wandering the streets of Black Hollow, disoriented and covered in scratches. His clothes were torn, his eyes wide with terror. He couldn't remember how he had gotten there, but the whispers never stopped. From that night on, Robert Turner became a different man. The townsfolk no longer saw him as the calm, logical teacher they had known. Instead, they saw a man haunted by the memory of the whistler, a creature that came from the darkness and whispered its awful promises to those it chose. And every night, when the wind picked up and the moon hung low in the sky, Robert would hear it, a distant whistle on the wind, soft and chilling, reminding him that the whistler was always near. Jack had always been different. Unlike the other kids in Westbrook, he wasn't afraid of the old stories or the warnings the adults gave him. He scoffed at the superstitions, thinking they were just that. Old tales meant to scare kids into behaving. The Hollow House had always intrigued him. It had stood there, silent and forgotten for years, its sagging porch and broken windows mocking the town's cautious eyes. Jack had passed it every day on his way to school, and every time he did, he felt a strange pull. Something about the house beckoned him, urging him to come closer. On his 18th birthday, Jack decided he would spend one night in the house. No one believed him when he told them. They laughed, called him crazy, and warned him that there were things better left alone. But Jack's mind was made up. At dusk, he set off toward Oak Street, carrying nothing but a flashlight and a backpack filled with snacks. He wasn't planning to stay for long, just long enough to prove to himself that the stories were nonsense. The house stood ahead, shrouded in mist, its outline barely visible under the dimming sky. He crossed the rusted gate and walked up the overgrown path toward the front door. The air felt colder, heavier, with every step. It was as though the house was watching him, waiting. He reached the door, and after a moment of hesitation, turned the knob. Inside, the house was as he expected, dusty, musty, filled with the smell of decay. But there was something else, something wrong. Jack flicked on his flashlight, its beam casting long shadows against the cracked wallpaper and broken furniture. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, and the air was thick with silence. Yet, in the back of his mind, something gnawed at him, an unsettling feeling that something was not quite right. He made his way through the foyer and into the living room, where a grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals covered in layers of grime. The room was empty, but the silence felt alive, as if the house itself was waiting for him to make a sound, to disturb its peace. As Jack explored deeper, he found a narrow staircase leading up to the second floor. He climbed the steps, feeling the weight of the house pressing against him. Every step echoed in the hollow space. When he reached the top, he turned left into the hallway. That's when he heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, faint but distinct. It was coming from one of the rooms. Jack froze. His heartbeat quickened. His flashlight flickered. He told himself it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal, but deep down, he knew better. There was something, or someone, in the house. He walked slowly toward the room, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. When he turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a small bedroom. The air inside was cold, too cold, and it felt as though it had been sealed off for years. The flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating a figure standing in the corner. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The figure was a woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and long black hair that hung in tangles around her face. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, stained with what looked like dark blotches. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she stared at Jack, not moving, not blinking. "Who are you?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. His mind raced. Was this a trick? A hallucination? The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there, staring at him with those cold, unblinking eyes. Jack felt his body begin to tremble. The room seemed to grow colder still, and the silence deepened. He could feel the weight of something terrible pressing down on him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Suddenly, the woman's mouth opened, and she let out a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't words, just a sound, like a breath drawn from the very depths of hell. And as the sound filled the room, the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, swirling in unnatural patterns. Before Jack could react, the woman's eyes locked onto his, and he felt a sharp, unbearable pull toward her. It wasn't a physical force. It was something deeper, something inside his chest, as if his soul itself was being drawn in. He tried to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the presence of the woman. The air grew so cold that he could see his breath, and the shadows began to close in, swallowing the room. The next morning, Jack's body was found outside the hollow house, lying in the overgrown yard. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth hung open, as if frozen in a silent scream. But there were no marks on him, no signs of injury, just a hollow emptiness in his stare, as if he had seen something so terrible that it had stolen his soul. The townspeople whispered that Jack had found the curse of the hollow house, that once you entered, you couldn't leave, not truly. It was as though the house itself consumed you, drawing you into its dark embrace until there was nothing left but the cold echo of your presence. And every so often, late at night, when the wind howls through Oak Street, the faintest sound of a woman's whisper can still be heard from inside the hollow house. It's said that if you listen closely enough, you might hear Jack's voice, trapped forever in the darkness. Do you dare come back for more? Subscribe now and become a part of Dark Whisper.